So thank you all for coming in on a rainy Thursday morning. Andrew Hunter should be here soon, but we'll do a soft start, for all of you that didn't make it in on time, and we expect probably a few more people will be rolling in. So the name of this event, striking the best deal for the government, cost plus, or fixed price versus cost-based contracts, indicates an interest in larger discussions here. We aren't going to come out with a firm answer at the end. So if you're hoping for A or B solution at the end of this panel, I'm afraid we're going to slightly disappoint you. But instead, we're going to speak of, what circumstance each one works best in, what are some of the weaknesses, what are some of the trends in how they're being used now, and get to some of the data on the questions. So we are very lucky in our panel, and so thank you three for attending. We have Michele Mackin, right, who is Director for the U.S. Government Accountability Office and Acquisitions and System Management Team. And in that capacity, she provides direct support for congressional committees and members. And you've been with them since 1988 as Evaluator of National Security and International Affairs Division, focused on military aircraft issue. And she'll speak to a couple of the GAO reports on the matter. Diane Balderson is the Vice President of Contracts and Pricing at Northrop Grumman. She comes from her most recent position as Director Assistant Commander for Contracts, Naval Air Systems, NAVAIR, where she was responsible for executing $30 billion in annual contractual obligations and expenditures and led 850 civilians, military, and contractor personnel across 7 major locations. And she was the first civilian to lead the NAVAIR contracting organization. And finally, Mandy Smithberger. Ms. Smithberger is a former National Security Policy Advisor to U.S. Representative Jackie Speer of California, worked on passing key provisions of the Military Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act into law, and she works at the project on POGO, where she is a director. Let me make sure I get what's your division? I had it wrong before.
I'm the director of the Straus Military Reform Project at the Center for Defense Information.
Yeah, so Straus Military Reform Office at Center for Defense Information. So we might get some more framing remarks when Andrew gets here, but to make efficient use of everyone's time, I'll get some into the actual study. Though first I should say that before we begin our program, I want to share our building safety precautions. Overall, we feel very secure in our building, but as a convener, we have a duty to prepare for any eventuality. Yeah, well, Andrew is here now, but I'll still serve as your responsible safety officer for the event. Please follow my instructions should the need arise. Finally, take a moment to familiarize yourself with the emergency exit, which I believe are to the left and to the back. Pathways to this room, your conference material also, so we have a visual depiction. And so we'll now turn back to our program. And Andrew, I was about to get into the event, but and I've introduced our panelists, but if you will have any setup remarks.
Well, Greg, thank you, and thank you for getting started. I apologize for being late. It was, I should have known when I heard that the forecast was for rain that traffic would not be good this morning, and it was not, but I'm here. So, and I'm so glad that our panel is here. We've got a great group. And this is actually the 4th of 4 studies that we did for the Naval Postgraduate School, all looking at issues in acquisition research that really get at the issue of how to strike the right deal, as we titled this event, how to make sure that the incentives in the contract align the interests of both the government and the contractor, so that in an ideal world, when the contractor makes the most profit, when the government gets the result that it's looking for. And so something that was done on this study, and I have to say that Greg was really the leading light behind this work, that was really and truly innovative, was using the data in the federal procurement data system to get measures of performance on the contract, to determine instances of cost growth, and of course, in some ways, sometimes the most important measure of performance, whether the contract was terminated prior to completion or not. And so this work was really quite innovative in using that data to get measures of performance that are often a little bit elusive in the acquisition system. So with that brief framing, I'm going to let Greg be the one to tell you in more detail about the work, and I am really looking forward to the discussion from our panel that gets at this question of how does the government strike the best deal.
So thank you, Andrew, and thank you to our contributing authors as well, Alexander Metiv, Reese McCormick, Maura McQuaid, and Guy Nezrabe. So as a little bit of framing, I've said before, but if you read 2 reports on the defense acquisition system, in addition to our fine GAO members and POGO, I do recommend the performance of a defense acquisition system, which is a OSD report that actually looked at the question of cost plus versus fixed price in 2013 and came to the conclusion that for MDAPs, there is not a major difference in cost growth between the two as used presently. Once you control for work content, aircraft contracts, and undefinitized contract awards. In a follow-up in 2014, they found that incentive fees actually did make a difference, though obviously we don't think you should just read those and go home. The major reasons that we build on that is we're looking at all defense contracts. Our sample is 2007 to 2013, only contracts completed in that period. And we are limiting ourselves to information that is available at contract start. Some questions like work content and controlling for it can be a little tricky because in theory a fixed price contract should dissuade you or at least make you hesitate before making certain changes in a way that a cost-based contract may not. So every control, every hypothesis we test for, we're trying to limit things that the contracting officer could know at the onset of a program. We are also limiting ourselves to open source data. There's some very interesting data out there in tools called Dave and Dimers that are available to some researchers, particularly those at certain FFRDCs, but are not available to the general public and are not available through FPDS. Every performance measure we include here is an FPDS, and the advantage of that is there's much more you can evaluate. It's available to a wider range of researchers, and we've cleaned it up and shared it. So if you're in the research community and are interested in building on this research, replicating us, showing that we're wrong, talk to me afterwards, and we're happy to provide it. And so there's a lot of contracting authority in this room, and so probably many of you could easily name off the top of your head when to do a fixed price contract and when to stick with cost-based. So you could just turn to a neighbor, but we'll do a slide that covers some of the standard ones. Firm requirements are key for fixed price. It's often costlier to change them. Availability of qualified suppliers. You want to make sure that the bids you get in are ones that you know the contractor can perform, and that because fixed price contracts have more trouble handling things when they go south, you want to make sure they have the funding available to complete and take on the risk. Low technical risk, fixed price for development is notoriously controversial and disfavored by large segments of the community. Availability of the vendor to avoid overruns, as I mentioned earlier, and the adequate business case if overruns occur. So if those last two are not present, when a fixed price contract goes bad, you may end up with nothing for your money and a good deal of time wasted. So a brief definition for those of you that really know the DFARS, we're doing fixed price and cost based. Most fixed price contracting types we're including in fixed price, for one exception is level of effort. Time and materials contracts, labor hours, we're grouping with cost based. There's different ways you could do that, but we thought it suited our analysis. And we are not looking at combination contracts. We're limiting ourselves to one where the contracting officers were able to make a call for at least 90% of the transactions by value. So how do we judge performance? 3 different ways. First off, are vendors willing to bid? Number of offers. One of the risks of fixed price contracts is because you put risk on the vendors, you may scare away all the contractors. You may only have a small pool, possibly only a small pool that's not knowing what they're getting in for. Terminations, as already mentioned, and we can tell partial and complete terminations. We can't differentiate between the two. And finally, change orders and ceiling breaches. So for Mr. Kendall and Todd Harrison note, our Todd Harrison now, the prices on fixed price contracts are only fixed if the contractual work and deliverables remain fixed. So the Air Force's Expeditionary Contract Support System is cited as a fixed price contract, but effectively became cost-based because of a number of changes. So I'm not going to get into detail on on the number of offers because that's covered in a variety of our reports, but terminations is a bit more interesting. So we judge terminations based on the reasons for modification field, and this, if you look at our breakdown, larger contracts are more likely to experience terminations, and we've got about $45 billion in obligations to contracts that were ultimately terminated. And this includes, both partial and complete, whether it's termination for cause, termination for convenience. Our assessment is that termination is such a pain that if you do it, at least something went wrong. Maybe it wasn't the vendor's fault, but something was very misspecified or the conditions greatly changed. And while in numerical terms, the majority of contract terminations actually were the smaller contracts, once you look at a percentage, it's very much the large ones. So for change orders and the contract breaches, ceiling breaches rather, we judge it by the changes in the base and all options value of the contract. We call that the ceiling in short. With the open source data, you can't tell how much money goes to specific contract line items that are related to a change order. You can only tell when the ceiling changes and what the reason for that change is. And similarly, contracts with larger ceilings are more likely to experience change orders, though a significant portion of contracts that experience changes actually had no change to their ceiling, and about a quarter actually had a negative change to the ceiling. So we look both at number of change orders and separately ceiling breaches. The data on ceiling breaches is only really reliable after 2007, similarly because that's when base and all options value become consistently available. The same is true for duration. So what did we find? These initial findings are not our hypothesis testing. They're just the overall observations on fixed price and cost-based. And as a reminder, none of these this is not a random experiment. Contracting officers are not rolling a dice to determine what to do. They are, it's the definition of selection bias. They are choosing what they think is the most appropriate contract type. So when we're giving our findings, we're finding how contracts are actually used in the system, and the contracting officers already incorporate much of the conventional wisdom. So that's why number of offers, or the most likely reason why, for number of offers, fixed price contracts actually receive more offers on average. But they are, generally speaking, going to be those less technically risky contracts, the simpler ones, the ones that are open to a wider range of vendors. So that means the contracting officers are doing their job and anticipating that problem. With ceiling, with change orders in contracting and ceiling breaches, fixed price contracts do receive more change orders, which makes sense because they're less flexible and you are more likely to need a change order to adjust to things. However, to our surprise, cost plus contracts did have more ceiling breaches. For terminations, though, the data is very much in keeping with conventional wisdom, and that in most categories, fixed price contracts were 100% more likely to be terminated, and sometimes dramatically above that. And we looked at a variety of controls that I'm not going to get into for time reasons. You have a report available, but we break out aircraft versus not aircraft contracts, undefinitized contract awards versus non-UCAs, single award IDVs versus other indefinite delivery vehicles versus definitive contracts versus purchase orders, and those contracts that have a 2+ year duration versus shorter, and those contracts that are competed or not. So for all the hypotheses I'm about to discuss, if you're curious, well, I wonder what it looks like under these conditions, please see our paper. So, large R&D. We did not actually find that as implemented, and this is as implemented by contracting officers that are rightly skeptical about using fixed price for development, that our hypothesis was held up. We found that there were Cost-based contracts for R&D did perform better on the ceiling breach category. The number of offers, again, probably for reasons of selection bias, when the government puts out a fixed price R&D, vendors are willing to show up. With terminations, it was a mixed finding. For those large fixed price contracts, they were more likely to be terminated. 10% of large fixed price R&D contracts were terminated. Below that, though, fixed price R&D performs better than the overall population. So it is possible that, well, at very least, contracting officers are not overly willing to use fixed price in those situations. When it came to MDAP, the findings were not particularly definitive either way. Contracts below 75 million received fewer offers, but there wasn't much in terms of performance. So for MDAPs, I probably would direct you to the performance of defense acquisition system reports. Longer durations are the areas where we found the most interesting findings, in my view. Longer durations are areas where fixed price contracts, as presently used by contracting officers, are running into disproportionately more problems. This doesn't mean everyone will do it. You know, the tanker may well be able to manage it well, but in general, contracting officers should probably be a little leery about using fixed price as it gets long, because the natural mechanism for that would be that it is harder to adjust them. They're more likely to hit termination problems or to hit ceiling breaches in the 1 million to 75 million category. Competition doesn't seem to do any favors for fixed price. It works slightly worse in terminations than the overall population. So it's apparently being appropriately used, but there's no way to just deal with the problems of fixed price weakness of fixed price contracts by ensuring that they're competed. We had a somewhat, the software one, we should emphasize, an unusual hypothesis driven from the literature was that software would do better with fixed price. That did not hold. And so with that, I will turn it over to our panelists.
Thank you. I'd like to offer some observations on contract type based on GAO's work over the years in looking at major acquisition programs, not just at DoD, but at other agencies as well. And Greg touched on some of these factors, but I just wanted to elaborate a little because they're really important in determining what the appropriate contract type is. Perhaps most importantly is how firm are the requirements. Is the system designed stable and affordable? And then secondly, how mature are the major component technologies? Are there unresolved design issues or integration risks that may pop up later and cause major redesign, which we do see happen in DoD programs? An example there is the Ford-class aircraft carrier, where some of the key critical technologies were not adequately tested before they were installed on the ship. Program managers are often somewhat optimistic on these first two because obviously their goal is to get their program up and running and funded. So that's something we pay attention to in our work. What actual cost history exists, perhaps from prior acquisitions from the contractor? And if you're buying multiple systems, is there room to transition from a cost plus initially to more of a firm fixed price contract type as the government learns more about the contractor's cost performance? And finally, more broadly, what's the prime contractor's overall financial position? As Greg mentioned, do they have the capacity to absorb cost overruns if it came to that? What does their cost performance look like on other government contracts? We all know that cost-plus contracts are more risky for the government, and I just thought I'd highlight an example of how this can play out. We looked at the first two lead Littoral combat ships. There were two lead ships because two different shipbuilders were doing different variants of the ships. These were cost-plus incentive and cost-plus award fee contracts. They had significant cost growth, 150%, so from about $200 million to about $500 million per hull. And the Navy accepted these ships in 2010 with, in an incomplete state. There were major deficiencies that were the contractor's responsibility, so hull, mechanical, electrical, welding problems, and so forth. The testing and trials had not been completed, and the Navy subsequently awarded cost-plus fixed-fee contracts to the same builders to complete the work. But as of last year, there were still deficiencies with the ships. It's not that this was the wrong contract type. It was probably very appropriate for lead ships. But this example just highlights the risk to the government. The government is not guaranteed a deliverable, in this case, a complete ship, under a cost reimbursement contract. The contractor is only required to make its best efforts under this contract type. Turning now to a type of fixed price contract, DoD and its Better Buying Power initiative has recently been emphasizing consideration of fixed price incentive contracts as a way to potentially save some money. And the idea is that under a firm fixed price contract, obviously the contractor is building all potential risk into its price. Under a fixed price incentive contract, the government and contractor negotiate a target price and a ceiling price, and based on a formula adjustment, they share the rewards of cost overruns or the risk, underruns, or the risk of cost overruns. To get more insight into how this is playing out, we actually have ongoing work looking at fixed price incentive contracts in shipbuilding. Part of what we're looking at, I think Greg touched on this, is the extent of changes to scope and to the target price for a ship within a class and across a class of ships, because typically the Navy does block buy contracting for its shipbuilding work. We're also looking to get back to those factors I discussed about what the government knows about the contractor's financial position, what the government knows about potential risk to the program when these contracts are negotiated, and how are those risks documented by the contracting officer and the program manager. And perhaps most importantly, we're going to try to assess actual outcomes under this contract type. Was fixed price incentive contracting successful in incentivizing contractor performance? And was it a good deal for DoD and the taxpayer? I'd like to now touch on an aspect that I think is sometimes overlooked, but it's very important when talking about contract type, and that's the acquisition workforce, and what information is available to the workforce to answer the questions that we posed earlier that inform contract type. Specifically, what does the program manager know about potential program risks, the requirements, the technology maturity, and so forth? And not the program manager, but system engineers, cost estimators, all the people who can inform these decisions. How is this information on risk shared with the contracting officer who's going to ultimately make the call on contract type and negotiate on behalf of the government? How is all this information factored into these decisions? As we all know, acquisition workforce has been cut over the past couple of decades. It's building back up now, and it's really important that the 1102 contracting officers and the program office staff have the information and skills they need to answer those questions on contract type. And finally, I wanted to comment on subcontracting as it relates to contract type. We and others have reported that subcontracting in major DoD programs can account for 70% or more of the work. So the questions here are, what does the government know about the prime contractor's contracting arrangement with its major subcontractors? What are the contract types? What's the extent of competition at the subcontract level? We've seen cases where the primes had a cost reimbursement contract with the government, but all their major subcontracts were firm fixed price. So the risk is flowing away from the prime in each direction, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just that that's information the government should have insight to in order to inform its own decisions about contracting with the prime. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Diane?
Mic on, right? Let you know that my comments are based on my 35 years of a practitioner in this area, not at all the Northrop Grumman official position on anything. So, and I want to add a couple of notes to what you heard already. regarding when to use appropriate contract type, what kinds of considerations. I agree with everything that's been stated so far, and I was glad to see you hint that acquisition workforce is something else that needs to be considered. All of the things you saw in the list that Greg put up there are important considerations for contract type, but also I'd add stable funding. If you're going to see whether a program performs well, you need to have stable funding, not just good, solid, rigid technical requirements and the other things mentioned there, but you need stable funding, and you also need trained acquisition workforce. If you don't have that, I don't think you're going to see a successful program and execution regardless of whatever contract type it is. So what I'd like to add are some general comments about contract type and choosing contracts, and then maybe a few general comments about the study, and then some specific things that I mentioned to Greg this morning that I want to tease out of the study that I might opine a little differently on. So first of all, I want to share with you that I'm a firm believer that you cannot take a development contract and make it a fixed price contract. It's a recipe for disaster. I lived through that on V-22 and A-12. A-12, basically, the lawyer that supported it for many years said she had a baby who grew all the way up and went through college before the A-12 settlement was final. A lot of money lost on that, a lot of manpower utilized across the department. And so, V-22 was not successful to begin with either because it started out as a fixed price type development contract and then ultimately, got transitioned over to cost type and was a successful product that delivered meaningful mission results to the Marine Corps and the Air Force. So I would definitely tell you that my experience is such that I would never like to see policy that would implement fixed price development contracts. I wanted to make a comment also about your observation with respect to cost type contracts being more risky for the government. That is true. However, I think there's this misconception or belief that there is no risk for the industry when it's a cost type contract. There is, whether it's a cost type incentive contract or a cost plus, award fee, et cetera. Often the industry makes a lot of investments in these contracts, and there is risk. So I don't want you to think that there's no risk on industry in a cost type contract. With respect to subcontracting and your comment about a lot of them being firm fixed price at a subcontract level, and I was going to raise this with respect to a comment in the study. I'm going to tie the two together. You're seeing more firm fixed price subcontracts when a prime is under a cost type contract, and you're wondering sometimes why that's the case. And the study, I believe, also says that more offerors will propose on a fixed price contract than a cost type contract. And I think you need to stratify that, number one. Number two, you need to think about the fact that many of our suppliers do not have the cost accounting systems in place to handle a cost type contract, and they also don't have all the different business systems that have to be approved. So they are going to migrate to fixed price type contracts because that's all they can do. Now, that may not be a major subcontractor because most of the major subs are covered under all of those systems. But when you get into the supply base, that's what you're going to see. They can only accept fixed price type contracts. So the onus of the risk is still on the prime contractor in that case. So I wanted to share that based on my observations of what's been said so far, as well as a couple comments in the study. More generally speaking, again, I think that there's a pressure to put risk on the contractors now, way more than it used to be. The risk is not something that the contractor community doesn't want to take on, and I would have said these same things whether I was government or now working for industry. It's a risk-reward equation, and for the industry to take on that kind of risk, the risk you see mentioned there relative to absorbing the overruns, there needs to be a good business case to support that, and that was commented on there as well. But you can't do it and at the same time continue to constrain the profits and fees that you want to see from industry as well. I recognize it's all about affordability, but there has to be a good business case there. And putting all the risk on the industry and reducing the fee you want out of the industry in the name of getting affordability is then leading to choosing a contract type that you can either reduce the fee to the industry or try to put all the risk on the industry. I think there needs to be a balance, and you need to really go through and assess those specific criteria before choosing a contract type. So another point is industry makes large investments in a lot of these particular deals, and they make investments in people, capital, other things in the industry, technology, et cetera. And if there isn't a reasonable return for the industry, or there isn't good cash terms, and that's another thing that the government is pushing pretty hard on, is reducing the cash terms for the industry. There has to be a balance to this. In order to get industry to do that type of investment, and there's strong competition within a company for those types of investment dollars, you need to be able to have a decent cash stream and a decent return so that the industry can do what they do, which is buy back stock in some cases, give dividends in some cases, and invest in the technology that our government customers really want to see us do. So there has to be a balance to that. I think that generally when it comes to the report, it was a very structured way of looking at a large disparate group of data, and the first time I've ever seen it analyzed that way, so I applaud you for that, I really do. I do think there's further analysis in some areas. I think we need to look maybe at large contractors versus small contractors, maybe isolate out whether those contractors could or couldn't take a cost type contract based on the accounting system things I mentioned earlier. I think perhaps we could look at other measures of value in addition to the ones that you looked at as well. And then specifically, there were a couple of quotes in here that I wanted to discuss with you. One was large aircraft contracts that are fixed price are much less likely to have ceiling breaches than cost-based. I'm thinking that was based on looking at mature aircraft programs such that it's follow-on production and not a R&D aircraft program. Is that correct?
So for the overall, yes, though. For the overall, yes, though there are, for each of those, we did look at, so there were some tests. We could also look at the R&D hypothesis to see whether it held there, and I don't have a paper on my hand, but that would be a way of checking. But yes, that is, in fact, a risk of the analysis.
So it was an aggregate, because I would agree, when you get down further in production, aircraft programs perform very well as a firm fixed price basis or fixed price incentive. But aggregating those with the development ones, I think it should be segregated out from a contract type perspective. Another thing is there was a comment in here about, sorry, it was a very comprehensive study, so I had some very comprehensive notes.
It's an honor to be read.
Vendors do appear to be capable of pricing in risk when bidding for fixed price contracts, resulting in less favorable fixed to cost ratio for ceiling breaches. I don't know that you can draw that conclusion without going and seeing just how much did the company absorb, based on when they originally proposed it, they must have thought of some fee and built that in. And then, what did they actually earn? And some of that you might be able to get out of the 10Ks with respect to whether they took some sort of a write-off or what have you. But I don't know that you can draw that conclusion without knowing how much did the company truly invest relative to did they lose fee or did they make better fee. And then I would say there was another comment in here that said that fixed price contracts receive no fewer bids on average than cost base. And then it goes on to say, this suggests that contracting officers did not push the boundaries of their monopsony power to such an extent that vendors were not willing to respond to solicitations. Well, when you have a large fixed price type competitive procurement, if the company wants to play, they're going to play, and it's competitive. They can't get that contract type changed. So you got to recognize that, you know, companies are going to propose if they want the business. And I don't think it's that PCOs didn't push their power. I think they also inherently chose a contract based on the risks that they looked at to begin with. So that's playing out as well. Another comment in here that said that the expense of cost contracts come from their higher ceilings, while the expense of fixed price comes from their change orders. Once again, I go back to, was it competed or not? If it was competed and a company chose to bid very aggressively, whether it's cost type or it's fixed price, I'm not sure you can draw that conclusion, because companies will make investments and they will bid aggressively on a cost type contract in order to win, particularly now when the department is using what I term LPTA very aggressively on major programs. They will tell you it's not LPTA because what they do is, in addition to looking at technical and going go, no go, so you pass the technical, pass performance, go, no go, so you pass performance, then they look at cost and they'll put an equation at the end that says if you're within this percentage of each other, or all offerors, the lowest priced offeror, then they'll calculate a equation that will give more credit to either the development side or the production side. Well, that's nothing but cost. I mean, seriously, that is low price technically acceptable. They term that as best value. So I think you have to look at definitions relative to was it competed or not, and how was it competed. And if I had the time and energy, I'd love to go look at what happens in terms of contractor performance on delivering products that meet value on time, on cost, and the warfighter can use it and the mission is successful, and how much did it truly cost the government, whether it was fixed price or it was cost type, and how was it competed. I am a firm believer that you're seeing less offerors on these LPTA types of major procurements that are competed than you would have seen if you did cost type development contracts. So LPTA is another thing I think probably requires further analysis. And let me see if there were any other comments in here I wanted to raise relative to specific things that I looked at. I think that's pretty much it, other than to say there was one other really big point. When you looked at ceiling breaches or change orders, there was I didn't see any differentiation for scope growth versus cost growth. And I don't think you can just measure, did a contract go up in price or did a ceiling increase, without differentiating between cost growth and scope growth. Particularly nowadays when we're keeping aircraft and ships and other things much longer in the inventory, we're doing a whole lot more, adding to their life cycle. Some of that gets put on these initial contracts, others are done on different contracts. So we're extending the life cycle of some of these contracts, and we're putting, which is one of your points, long duration, and putting more money on them for scope growth. I mean, a lot can change in terms of the technology. So I think the scope growth from the cost growth really needs to be differentiated out.
So we tried to get at that one. We use the reason for modification field to identify change orders. And there are a variety of modifications that are more in the scope growth category. There's ones that are just exercising an option. That's not really relevant here. There's whether it's for additional work within scope, additional work beyond scope, and both of those we did not consider change orders. We only took the ones that were directly change order or definitized change order, because we absolutely agree. How well that captures that dynamic, it's another question, but we did our best.
So I applaud your efforts. I think more stratification also in terms of dollar value, because to me, maybe because I came from, major defense acquisition procurements, $75 million, kind of chump change when you're buying Joint Strike Fighters and E-2Ds and, F-18s and those kinds of things. So I do think another stratification of the dollar value would be worthwhile too. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Diane. And Mandy.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Project on Government Oversight, we were founded in 1981 by Pentagon whistleblowers who are concerned about wasteful spending at the Pentagon. And then my project, the Straus Military Reform Project, is really focused on how do we have a more effective military at a lower cost. For POGO's work on contracting in particular, we've really been focused on inadequate competition, deficient accountability, a lack of transparency, and risky contracting vehicles. And always when we're talking about contracting, we're talking about what do you buy and how do you buy it. And today's report is really digging in a really important way, and thank you to so much to CSIS for doing this work, and to how are we buying this and are we getting the performance that we want. I agree with the other panelists that there's more analysis to be done, but I think that this is a really great way to start the conversation. With that said, it's important to remember that these different kinds of contract vehicles are just tools. They're not inherently good, they're not inherently evil. It's about making sure that we apply them in the appropriate places. And with that said, it's really difficult to come up with good performance metrics to understand how we're using these and if we're using them correctly. I think that we've chosen some good ones to start the conversation, but even these are a little bit noisy. As Greg was saying, it's hard to know if a contract vehicle was the main reason that a contract was terminated, and in some cases, change orders are appropriate. We're not surprised to see that fixed price contracts are terminated more often because of all of the reasons that Greg said. It's much more difficult to make change orders. And sometimes you just need to start over. Where we think there could be more research is looking at what happened after that termination for us to really understand to what degree it was the contracting vehicle. Was it that we had the wrong requirements? Was it that we just didn't need it anymore? And so as we dig into that more, I think that'll really help us to understand if these vehicles are being used appropriately. Let's see. The other thing that I wanted to talk about are just some other factors that we see impacting competition that were beyond the scope of this report, but we think are important to keep in mind when we're talking about getting the best and most innovative products for the government at affordable prices. In particular, we're concerned about contract bundling, which I know many in the community are as well, and appreciated the comments that the GAO was making about subcontracts. We also get concerned about political engineering, so not necessarily choosing subcontractors because that's going to get the best outcome, but because it's going to make it politically impossible to cancel. Harder to come up with performance metrics to really show what is happening there and to understand that, but we do think that that's a dynamic that we have to keep as part of the conversation. Similarly, we see less competition than we would like to see in some cases due to incumbent contractors. In some cases, contracts are actually steered to specific vendors, and so there really was no expectation that there would be competition. And the most pernicious examples, there might be a revolving door kind of issue or just a preference for a certain vendor. And then sometimes the requirements are just bad, or the contract is structured terribly, so vendors don't want to bid. With that in mind, we've generally found that contractors like fixed price contracts when it's profitable and prefer cost plus if the company is likely to have to operate at a loss, which makes sense. They're making money. And I really appreciate what Diane was bringing into the conversation too, and talking about with subcontracts, and particularly when you're using fixed price, it is important to keep in mind that you then don't have to have cost accounting standards and a lot of TINA requirements that can be cumbersome. So in some cases, it can be really good for the government and for companies to be able to use those kinds of fixed price contracts because you can reduce administrative burdens. Again, you have to know what you're buying. It doesn't work if you don't know what you're buying, but it does allow for a more streamlined process. I also kind of wanted to just dig in a little bit more into the political context as to why we're talking so much about fixed price contracts and why so many politicians really think that we should be using them more in the Department of Defense. And it is important to remember that there were both real and perceived abuses of cost-plus contracts. And I think it's right that there's probably been overcorrection, but that this is part of that dynamic. And I think it's important for both government agencies and for industry to do their best to be best actors and not furthering those abuses so that we can use contract tools appropriately. And again, particularly, obviously Senator John McCain has become a big booster in addition to President Obama with his March 2009 memo, really pushing towards fixed price contracts. That said, for POGO, we do like the presumption of looking at, is this something that could be done in a fixed price basis? Because we think it's fruitful for thinking through, is it okay that we don't really know what our requirements are going to be? Is it okay how many unknowns are going to be that require us to have an inherently riskier contract for the government structure? And so we think that presumption is good, but it shouldn't be a mandate. And it's not, obviously, but it's about having that appropriate balance. Let's see. Similarly, just as you can fixate too much on the contracting vehicle type, we think it's easy to fixate too much on profit or to fixate too much on overhead without really looking at what's the best value for the taxpayer. We've definitely looked at instances where the overhead was higher on a certain contract, but ultimately the better value for taxpayers was going to be for the other bidder. But again, from our perspective as a taxpayer organization, we think concerns about profit should largely just be the concerns of industry, and they should manage their own house, and that contracting officers and Pentagon brass, that should not be their predominant concern when they're evaluating bids. As was mentioned earlier, the acquisition workforce is also a really key part of this conversation. And it's really getting the right people that's really going to determine whether we get the best value. As was mentioned, reinventing government really decimated the acquisition workforce. You had Duncan Hunter Sr. referring to them as shoppers. It's not exactly giving them the kind of credentials that we really think that they have. And at the same time, we saw a significant increase at contracting expenditures. So CRS calculated that going from about 190 billion in 2000 to 290 billion in 2014. So a total mismatch, how much money was going out the door and how many people were really evaluating it, which again led to doing things like more bundling and how can we do all of these things more efficiently and just deal with how much is coming at us. Congress, recognizing the shortfall, has made a significant investment in rebuilding this workforce, both in getting more people and increasing training. The GAO calculated that we went from about 126,000 people to about in 2008 to about 53,000 in March 2015. And really, we think this investment benefits taxpayers, it benefits industry, because everyone wants to have smart buyers in place. Today's report shows that some of this investment seems to be paying off, or they seem to be applying these tools appropriately. But it's not completely clear if it's totally paying off, particularly at the Department of Defense. This week, the GAO released a report that pointed out that there really isn't a good strategic plan for how to use all of these funds and to make sure that we're filling key shortfalls in staff and really getting the outcomes that we want. For a long time, the Pentagon begged off on that, saying, well, it's early, it's kind of hard for us to tell if we're getting the outcomes that we want. What we want, we should be starting to know now, and we should be figuring out how to evaluate that so we can recalibrate appropriately. And finally, successful contracts are really about getting things, good up front, making sure that contracting officers share information with the other experts that they work with so that you build a good contract that have appropriate requirements, that you have appropriate abilities to change things up front where you know that there are going to be problems instead of trying to do change orders afterwards and really trying to anticipate reasonable things that are going to happen over the course of the program. And we really think that if you build up, the what you buy better, you can then also use those contracting vehicles the most appropriately to get the best value. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mandy. Thank you to all the panelists for those comments. And I great input and feedback, so thank you very much for that. I will say one issue, and I agree wholeheartedly with several comments that were made, that you have to look at each contract to understand, why was a termination done. Each one is its own particular story of life. The one thing I will say methodologically about how we handle that generally in DIG research is we agree each contract is unique, and our findings can't say that on contract X something happened because of this or that factor. But we do believe that over a sample size of many tens of thousands, if not millions of contracts, that trends can emerge. And so while any individual contract may not have terminated because it was the wrong contract type, if you were to see a huge disparity of performance across millions of contracts, I think it becomes legitimate to conclude that, that there is something going on. In this case, of course, we didn't find that, which was the interesting finding, is despite the expectation that you would, for example, see the conventional wisdom that under fixed price contracts you get huge numbers of change orders, and that's where industry is making all its profit, you don't in fact see a big difference. And in cost type contracts, you're going to see huge ceiling breaches because you can just get away with it in a cost plus contract. You don't see a huge difference in the amount or the degree, extent of change orders. So really an interesting finding. I have to give Diane credit because you really identified, I think, a source of selection bias that we hadn't thought about, which is the fact that not everyone has a CAS system and can do a cost type contract. A very elemental point. It's not something I recall us talking about when we were thinking through our methodology, so thank you for that. And it's always good to be schooled and get smarter. So we don't have too much time remaining. I do want to ask a question and then turn to audience questions. So I'm going to kind of roll up. I had 3 questions. I'm going to try and roll them all up into one question. Again, the study sort of identifies that by and large we don't see that there's a huge difference in the performance metrics that we evaluated between fixed price contracts and cost plus. And you all referenced key factors, but I really want to dig into this issue of if is or is not contract type, in your view, a key factor in the success of a contract, and if not, what are the key factors? Is it incentive? Is it just the skill of the workforce? I shouldn't say just, but is it primarily the skill of the workforce? And what do you think those key factors are if they aren't contract type?
I think for time reasons, I'd like to hear more about from panelists.
I think it is a key factor, but I would go back to those questions that we posed about requirements, technologies, government insight, and so at the end of the day, I think it is the acquisition workforce bringing their judgment to the table, understanding the contractor's position. Of course, they need to make a profit, but where should that line be? And it really goes back to the insights the government has into the risks, into the contractor's position, so the government can go to that negotiation table and negotiate the best deal for the taxpayer.
Contract type is important, very much so, but if it's used appropriately, it will be successful. Understanding and being schooled in those different criterias, and then actually being able to go look at historical data and do some research and appreciate where there have been successes and failures and why there have been successes and failures before choosing a contract type. And in MDAPs, it's in the statute that the MDA, the Milestone Decision Authority, is the one who chooses the contract type. It's not even the PCO. So the MDAP, MDA, chooses the contract type. It's a lot of input from a lot of different people in the department in selecting contract type. And now, as I said earlier, I believe they're choosing contract type more based on how can they control the risk. And it's okay to go fixed price as long as there's a reasonable reward associated with that. As long as you have competitions that are going to drive industry to bid very aggressively, you're going to see some failures. Unless there's recognition for the delta between the way industry bid and what the government determines to be a more reasonable estimate. So it's a hard question to really answer. It is a contributor to success, but there's so many bases upon thinking about which one to choose. And I don't think that the choice is the PCOs alone anymore. I think they're being told, even though you read better buying power, what have you, they're being told to fix price incentive just about everything nowadays. So I also think there's a lot of risk when you start combining a new development program with, under a competition, with LRIPs. So you've got all this concurrency that's going on. It's a very hard question to answer. You know, if you're brand new in a big long-term development contract, and then you also price the first couple of LRIPs as fixed price incentives, there's going to be risk. And you know, it might not always work out to be successful if successfulness is determined to be those 4 measures. I know I didn't give you a clear answer, but...
Well, you know, I'm almost tempted to, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I will a little bit, and also happens to align with my own viewpoint, which is it may be more important than which contract type you're doing as to why are you doing what you're doing. Because there are reasons to go with fixed in the right circumstances, there are reasons to go with cost in the right circumstances, and it seems to me the real key issue is why are you doing what you're doing? And if you can explain it clearly, as was mentioned by Mandy, you know, you need to think through, why am I in this contract if I don't really know exactly what I'm trying to buy? Right. There may be a reason, and there is frequently a reason, but anyway.
And you know, it's interesting because you also see the strong bias towards fixed price incentive contracts nowadays for production programs that have been in production for 9, 10, 12, 15 years, when traditionally those were firm fixed price. And the department would tell you that, you know, they think that the industry is achieving unreasonable fees, and that's why they want to claw back some of that in an incentive arrangement. And I would offer that industry is not earning unreasonable fees. So I don't believe firm fixed price contracting is necessarily used to the greatest extent that it used to be used and could still be used.
Mandy, do you have thoughts on?
Again, I think it really comes down to application. So you really are talking about the workforce and making sure that they manage risk appropriately, that if they're issuing waivers to requirements as they're managing programs, that they're doing that appropriately and not just for convenience, that you have someone who looks at the level of concurrency in the Joint Strike Fighter program and says, this is insane. You know, and then you get to misapply production contracts and all of those kinds of things because you've made bad decisions previously and you're trying to correct for it.
Let me see if we have audience questions. We do. So here, they'll bring a mic over to you here in the front.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. The focus of the discussion sounds like it's been on purchases of things and major platforms. Given that you know, more than half of the defense acquisitions are in services, how would you modify this for services contracts? Your analysis.
So we do include, but do not control for services contracts in this study. So that's not been so I think that actually might be an area that would be interested to do some follow-up in. And I think that many of the measures are still relevant, though I think with services, it's even the question of doing the differentiation between what new work in and out of scope probably is a slightly different answer for what that means for products, where products might just be buying more of a thing. For services, you might have to think a little harder about how that works. So it is available within the data. There's room to build on it further. And part of the reason we didn't do as much in it, I don't think we found in our literature review as much discussion about services versus products for fixed price versus cost-based versus the discussion of, you know, the specific question of development and R&D.
Other questions from the audience? Here on the...
Yes, I'm Russell King, Navy veteran. I recently heard Senator McCain at a conference, and he was talking about how he couldn't justify getting a new aircraft carrier with his constituents at home. And then after that, another panelist was talking about the strategy of various parts of the world, and the carrier was the center of each of the strategy in each of the regions of the world. And I know from a pork barrel standpoint, McCain in Arizona gets nothing from an aircraft carrier, whereas my home state of Virginia gets a jackpot. And carrier building is monopolistic, you know, and I think it's Newport News Shipbuilding would build it. How would you approach getting new aircraft carriers? What are some of the contracting challenges and opportunities with that?
Well, as you mentioned, the government is buying 3 new aircraft carriers. Newport News Shipbuilding's building the Ford-class carriers. The first one was a cost-plus contract, and the next 2 are fixed-price incentive contracts. So we do have ongoing work looking at those procurements. They're very expensive, there's no doubt about it. There have been huge cost overruns, but on the other hand, you're not going to buy half of a carrier. So once you have that contract in place and construction has begun, the government has to work out a way to afford it. And I guess our position is try to control those costs the best you can. For example, make sure those key technologies are mature and tested before you install them on the ship, because that's a huge cost driver.
I mean, one thing I would say about shipbuilding in general is shipbuilding is in many ways a different game than most of the rest of acquisition. And it's not to say that it's necessarily harder, but it's different in the perspective that you don't build a prototype of an aircraft carrier. You know, when you start to build an aircraft carrier, that's the thing, and you don't get a chance to test. You know, you can build modules and maybe test out new designs in that fashion, but you can't build the whole thing until you go to build the whole thing. And so in the normal acquisition process, you know, you have the fly before you buy principle, and you can build a demonstrator and fly it and work out the kinks and then figure it out. And so your first production item, you hope, is one where you've really narrowed in on what that's going to cost and what the risks are. But when you're going to build a ship, a first-in-class ship, it's just simply not possible. You're going to be learning as you build of necessity. And so my own view, and it's not, I guess, a popular view, is that the cost performance of the first of the Ford class is actually not bad. I don't find it surprising, and I don't find it shocking, and I don't find it terrible. I find it to be pretty well in line with first-of-class ships generally, if not to some extent for something as complex as an aircraft carrier, potentially even, you know, I think historians 30 years from today, when there was no emotion invested in it, might look back and say that was pretty good, actually, to come in at the percentage of cost growth that they're coming in at. It's a shocking number in absolute terms, you know, billions of dollars of cost growth. And I'm not excited or happy that it happened, but there is something different about building a ship in particular, and also an aircraft carrier, that makes that first ship going to be something that is likely to experience cost growth.
Oh, the one other thing I would add is this is also when it becomes important to be honest brokers. And in this case, my understanding is that the Navy wasn't a very honest broker in predicting what kind of cost growth we were going to see on that first ship, and that they came in almost exactly at where industry thought they were going to come based on the technological risk. So again, in helping to make those be better decisions so you don't have those kinds of cost overruns. If you start off budgeting with what it's actually going to cost, you don't get an overrun.
Very fair point. We have time for one more question if there is anyone in the audience who has not yet. Okay, I don't see any hands raised. So we are at the, just a little past the hour. I want to thank everyone for coming. The report is available on the CSIS website. It is meaty. There's quite a bit there. So for those who haven't had a chance to go through it line by line like Diane, please avail yourself of that opportunity. Greg also mentioned that he's done an amazing amount of work actually on the data side of this. That data is available. That data set is available. As I mentioned, the Naval Postgraduate School sponsors this acquisition research, and it's for the public benefit. It is not something private to DoD. This is research for the public benefit, and so that data is available to those who might want to follow up on the services question or on some of these other questions that have been raised. And please join me in thanking our panelists.